The charred remains of the Whitmore farmhouse stood like broken teeth against the Utah sky. Everything Harold and Martha had built over 40 years reduced to ash and twisted metal. The old Mormon couple had lost more than their home that October night. Family photos, Martha's grandmother's quilt, Harold's mission journals, a lifetime of memories gone in minutes. But Harold recognized the young man standing at their gate 3 months later, work boots dusty, tool belt hanging from lean hips. The same dark eyes that had stared back from security footage. The same hands that had lit the match. "Name's Tyler," the stranger said, voice steady despite the tremor in his jaw. "I'm here about your house." What Harold didn't know was that Tyler wasn't just any drifter with a guilty conscience. He was the grandson Martha never knew existed, the child her estranged daughter had hidden for 23 years before overdosing in a Phoenix motel. Some fires destroy, others reveal what was always meant to be found. But can forgiveness rebuild what hatred burned down, or will the truth about Tyler's real identity ignite something far more dangerous? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Harold's weathered hands gripped the gate so tight his knuckles went white. 3 months ago he might have lunged at this boy, might have let 40 years of righteous living crumble in a moment of rage, but grief had a way of hollowing a man out, leaving room for things he'd never expected. "I know who you are," Harold said quietly. Tyler flinched but held his ground. "Then you know why I'm here." "Do I?" Harold studied the young man's face. There was something familiar there beyond the security footage, something that tugged at memories older than October's flames. The shape of his jaw, maybe, the way he held his shoulders when nervous. Martha appeared on the trailer steps, her grey hair pulled back in its usual bun, wearing the same blue dress she'd worn to church for 15 years. One of only 3 dresses the Red Cross had provided. Everything else was ash. "Harold?" Her voice carried across the barren lot where their garden used to bloom. "Who's that?" Tyler's head turned at the sound, and Harold caught something raw across his features. Recognition? Longing? The boy's lips parted slightly, as if he'd forgotten how to breathe. "Just someone about the rebuilding, dear," Harold called back, never taking his eyes off Tyler. "Go on inside. I'll be along shortly." Martha hesitated, then retreated into the temporary trailer that had become their entire world. 12 feet by 40 feet of borrowed space, courtesy of the bishop's fund and community mercy. "She looks tired," Tyler said, so quietly Harold almost missed it. Losing everything tends to do that to a person. Tyler winced. "I know you called the police. I know they're looking for me. Are you turning yourself in?" "I'm trying to make it right first." Tyler gestured toward the ruins. "I've got money, insurance money from a job I did in Nevada. Clean money," he added quickly. "I want to rebuild what I took." Harold laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think money fixes this? You think lumber and nails can bring back 40 years? No." Tyler's voice cracked. "But it's a start." A wind picked up across the valley, stirring the ash that still lingered in corners where the fire department's hoses couldn't reach. Harold watched Tyler's face as the boy stared at the destruction, saw something that looked like grief but ran deeper. Guilt had its own geography, its own terrible landscape. "Why?" Harold asked. "Of all the houses in Utah, why ours?" Tyler was quiet for so long, Harold thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of something broken. "I was looking for someone I thought lived here. When I found out I was wrong, I was angry, drunk, stupid." He paused. "That's not an excuse. There is no excuse. Who were you looking for?" Another pause, longer this time. Tyler's eyes drifted to the trailer where Martha had disappeared. "My grandmother. I thought she still lived at the old address. But the records were old and He stopped himself. "It doesn't matter now." But it did matter. Harold felt something shift in his chest, a recognition so profound it stole his breath. The familiar jawline, the way Tyler's mouth moved when he was nervous, exactly like Martha's youngest daughter, Rebecca, who'd run away at 17 and never come home. Rebecca, who'd broken Martha's heart completely. Rebecca, who might have had children Martha never knew about. "Son," Harold said carefully, "what was your grandmother's name?" Tyler met his eyes, and Harold saw the truth there before he spoke. Saw it in the desperate hope, the fear, the longing that had brought a young man back to face the people he'd wronged. "Martha," Tyler whispered. "Martha Whitmore." The insurance adjuster's business card lay crumpled in David's trash can, but the man's words echoed in his mind as he stood in what used to be their kitchen. Accelerant patterns suggest professional knowledge. 3 weeks had passed since the fire, and the acrid smell of smoke still clung to everything, seeping into his clothes, his hair, his dreams. Sarah emerged from the back bedroom carrying another box of salvaged items, mostly photographs in warped frames and a few pieces of her grandmother's china that had somehow survived. Her face was streaked with soot, her usually pristine appearance replaced by the practical uniform of disaster. Old jeans, a faded BYU t-shirt, work gloves that were too big for her hands. "The bishop called," she said, setting the box down carefully. "The Relief Society has enough donations to get us through another month, maybe 2. David nodded, but didn't turn around. He was staring at the corner where their kitchen table used to sit, where they'd shared breakfast every morning for 8 years, where Sarah would grade papers while he reviewed case files. Now it was just a black stain on concrete. "David, I heard you. Did you call Detective Morrison back?" He had, 3 times, each conversation more frustrating than the last. No leads, no witnesses, no suspects. Just another house fire in a city that averaged 24 arsons per year. The case would remain open, Morrison assured him, but David knew what that meant. It would collect dust until another fire provided fresh evidence, or the perpetrators struck again. "They're doing everything they can," he said, which wasn't exactly a lie. Sarah's reflection appeared beside his in the blackened window frame. "You don't believe that." She knew him too well. 8 years of marriage had given her an uncanny ability to read the tells he'd perfected in courtrooms, the slight tension in his shoulders when he was holding something back, the way his jaw tightened when he was angry but trying not to show it. "What I believe doesn't matter. What I can prove does. This isn't a courtroom, David. This is our life." Their life. What was left of it anyway? The fire had taken more than their house. It had taken their sense of safety, their routine, their carefully constructed world. They were staying in the Marriott downtown, living out of suitcases, eating takeout for every meal. Sarah had been sleeping badly, jerking awake at the smallest sounds. David hadn't been sleeping at all. "We should start looking at other neighborhoods," Sarah said quietly. "Maybe West Jordan, or even Draper. The insurance settlement will go further if we—" "No." The sharpness in his voice surprised them both. Sarah took a step back. "This is our home," he continued, moderating his tone. "This is where we planned to raise our children, where we wanted to build our life together. I'm not going to let some lunatic with a gas can chase us away." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, picking through the debris with the toe of her shoe. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Maybe this is God's way of telling us it's time for a change." David felt something cold settle in his stomach. This was new territory for them. Sarah questioning divine providence, looking for meaning in destruction. She was usually the one with unwavering faith, the one who found purpose in every trial, who spoke confidently about God's plan even when David's own testimony wavered. "You think God wanted our house to burn down?" "I think maybe we were getting too comfortable, too focused on material things." She gestured at the ruins around them. "Look at how upset we are about losing objects, things we can replace." These weren't just things, Sarah. This was 8 years of our marriage, our first home, the place where we— He stopped himself. The place where they'd tried to conceive a child for 3 years. The place where Sarah had cried every month when the pregnancy tests came back negative. The place where they'd finally decided to start the adoption process, filling out forms at that same kitchen table that was now ash. "I know," she said softly, and he realized she was thinking about the same moments. But maybe this is an opportunity to start fresh somewhere else. A clean slate. David pulled out his phone and scrolled to a number he'd called twice already that day. His contractor friend, Mike Hendricks, who'd given him a rough estimate for rebuilding. 200,000 minimum, maybe more, depending on what they wanted. The insurance would cover most of it, but it would take months, maybe a year. "I'm calling Mike tomorrow," he said. "Getting a formal bid." Sarah's sigh was audible. "David, we can't afford not to. This is about more than money, Sarah. It's about not giving up. It's about standing our ground." What he didn't tell her was that he'd already made another call to a private investigator who specialized in arson cases. Because if the police couldn't find who did this, David would find them himself. The courthouse steps felt cold beneath Sarah's feet as she waited for David to finish his conversation with Detective Morrison. 3 days had passed since Marcus Reed's visit, and sleep had become a stranger to their home. Every creak of the house settling, every whisper of wind through the trees brought back memories of that terrible night 5 years ago when flames had devoured everything they'd built together. "Mrs. Chen?" A voice interrupted her spiraling thoughts. She turned to see a young woman with tired eyes and ink-stained fingers. "I'm Jessica Martinez from the Tribune. I was hoping we could talk about Marcus Reed's release." Sarah's stomach clenched. "I don't have anything to say. But you're the victims. People want to know how you feel about him being back in town, especially after what happened to your daughter." "My daughter is fine." The words came out sharper than Sarah intended. She glanced toward the courthouse doors, willing David to emerge and rescue her from this conversation. Jessica stepped closer, her voice dropping to what she probably thought was a compassionate tone. "The fire report mentioned she was trapped in her bedroom. That kind of trauma doesn't just disappear. And now he wants to rebuild your house? That has to bring up some complicated emotions." Sarah's hands trembled as she gripped her purse tighter. "We've moved on. We've forgiven." "Have you really?" Jessica's pen hovered over her notepad. "Because forgiveness and trust are different things, aren't they? Would you let him into your current home? Would you leave him alone with your daughter?" The questions hit like physical blows. Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. The truth was too complicated, too messy for a newspaper article. How could she explain that forgiveness felt like a daily choice, one she sometimes failed at? How could she admit that some nights she still woke up screaming, not from the memory of flames, but from dreams where Emma didn't make it out? "Sarah." David's voice carried relief as he jogged down the courthouse steps. "Sorry to keep you waiting." His eyes took in the reporter, and his expression hardened. "Can I help you?" Jessica smiled with practiced ease, just getting the community's perspective on recent events. "Your wife was telling me about the forgiveness process." "No, she wasn't." David moved protectively beside Sarah. "We're not interested in talking to the press." "But surely you have concerns about Marcus Reed's intentions? Building a house next door to his victims seems like an unusual choice for someone seeking redemption." David's jaw tightened. "Marcus served his time. What he does now is between him and God. And if he reoffends? If there are more fires?" "There won't be," Sarah found herself saying, surprising everyone, including herself. Both David and Jessica stared at her. "He's not the same person who set that fire." David's hand found hers, squeezing gently. She knew he was thinking the same thing she was. How could they be so certain? How did anyone really know what lived in another person's heart? Jessica scribbled furiously. "So you support his construction project?" "We support second chances," David said carefully. "That's what our faith teaches us, even when those second chances might put your family at risk." The question hung in the air like smoke. Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the same sensation she'd experienced every day for months after the fire. She'd learned to breathe through it, to push past the panic, but standing here on these courthouse steps with a stranger demanding answers to questions she asked herself every night, the walls felt like they were closing in. "Excuse us," David said firmly, guiding Sarah toward their car. Jessica called after them. "The community deserves to know if they're safe. What if this isn't really about redemption? What if Marcus Reed came back for another reason entirely?" Sarah stumbled, David's grip the only thing keeping her upright. Another reason. The thought had been lurking in the shadows of her mind since Marcus's visit, but she'd pushed it away each time it surfaced. People didn't usually return to the scene of their crimes to make amends. They returned to finish something. "Don't listen to her," David murmured as they reached the car. "She's just trying to sell papers." But as they drove home through streets lined with the golden aspens of early fall, Sarah couldn't shake Jessica's words. The reporter had voiced the questions that kept Sarah awake at night, the doubts that made her faith feel fragile and uncertain. When they turned onto their street, Sarah's breath caught. There, standing in the empty lot where their old house had been, was Marcus Reed. He wasn't alone. A woman with graying hair stood beside him, her hand resting on his arm in a gesture that seemed both protective and possessive. Even from a distance, Sarah could see the woman scanning the neighboring houses with calculating eyes, her gaze lingering on the Chen family's current home. "David," Sarah whispered, "who is that with him?" David slowed the car, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. "I don't know, but I think we're about to find out." The morning light filtered through the kitchen curtains as Sarah poured coffee into two mismatched mugs, her hands steadier than they'd been in days. Across the table, Michael sat hunched over architectural drawings, his fingers tracing the charcoal lines that outlined their future home. The irony wasn't lost on her. Blueprints drawn by the same hands that had once held matches. "The foundation's solid," Michael said without looking up. "Inspector confirmed it yesterday. We can build on what's left." Sarah nodded, though something cold settled in her stomach. 3 weeks had passed since David Chen had knocked on their door with his impossible offer, and still she felt like they were walking through a minefield. The insurance money sat untouched in their account, enough to hire any contractor in the county, enough to start fresh somewhere else entirely. But here they were, planning a future with the man who had stolen their past. The sound of gravel crunching under tires drew her attention to the window. David's pickup truck pulled into their temporary driveway, early as always. Sarah watched him climb out, noting how he moved differently now, careful, deliberate, like someone afraid of taking up too much space in the world. "He's here," she announced, surprised by the neutrality in her own voice. Michael rolled up the drawings and stood. "Remember what Bishop Gardner said about charity. This could be the Lord's way of healing all of us." Sarah wanted to believe that. In her prayers each night, she asked for the same peace that seemed to come so naturally to her husband. But forgiveness felt like a muscle she'd forgotten how to use, atrophied from years of believing in a world where good and evil wore clearly marked uniforms. David knocked softly before entering, tool belt already strapped around his waist. His face carried the same haunted expression Sarah had grown accustomed to, part determination, part penance. "Morning," he said, removing his baseball cap. "I've been thinking about the kitchen layout. With the new plumbing configuration, we could expand the island, maybe add that pantry Sarah mentioned." It still unnerved her how he remembered every detail of their conversations, cataloguing their preferences with the intensity of someone trying to resurrect the dead. She found herself wondering if this attention to their desires was another form of manipulation, a way to earn forgiveness through careful observation of their needs. "That sounds fine," Michael said, his enthusiasm genuine. "Sarah's been wanting more storage space for years." David turned to her expectantly and she managed a small smile. "It would be nice," she admitted. Over the past weeks, she'd watched David work with a precision that bordered on obsession. Every nail driven with perfect accuracy, every measurement checked twice, then 3 times. He arrived before dawn and stayed until dusk, rarely stopping for breaks, as if the physical labor could somehow balance the scales of justice. The phone rang. startling all three of them. Sarah answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Anderson? This is Detective Morrison with the County Sheriff's Department." Sarah's grip tightened on the receiver. "Yes? I'm calling about David Chen. I understand he's been doing work on your property?" She glanced at David, who had gone very still. "That's correct. Ma'am, I need you to know that we've reopened his case. New evidence has come to light regarding the fires from 7 years ago. There may have been additional incidents we weren't aware of." The room felt suddenly airless. "Additional incidents? I can't share details of an ongoing investigation, but I wanted to warn you to be cautious. Mr. Chen may not have been as forthcoming about the extent of his activities as he's led you to believe." Sarah's eyes found David's face, searching for denial, for surprise, for anything that might contradict the detective's words. Instead, she saw resignation. "Thank you for calling," she managed, and hung up. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Michael looked from Sarah to David, confusion creasing his features. "What's going on?" Michael asked. David sat heavily in one of their folding chairs, his tool belt clanking against the metal frame. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "There were other fires," he said. 3 more. Before yours." The admission hit Sarah like a physical blow. "You lied to us. I told you about the fire that mattered, the one that made me stop." David's hands trembled as he removed his work gloves. "The others, they were empty buildings, abandoned places. I told myself no one got hurt." "But people did get hurt," Sarah said, her voice rising. "Insurance companies, property owners, communities. You weren't just some troubled kid making one terrible mistake. You were a serial arsonist." Michael sank into his chair, the architectural drawings forgotten. "Why didn't you tell us?" "Because you never would have let me help you. And I need to help you. I need to fix what I broke, even if I can't fix everything." The morning light filtered through the kitchen window as Sarah poured coffee into 2 mismatched mugs. Her hands steadier than they'd been in weeks. David sat at the table, methodically buttering toast while scanning the local newspaper, a ritual that had once brought them comfort, but now felt like checking for landmines. "Nothing in today's edition," he said, folding the paper with deliberate care. "Maybe people are starting to move on." Sarah set his mug down, noting how he avoided her eyes. The silence between them had grown heavier since Marcus Webb's unexpected visit 3 days ago. They'd barely spoken about it, dancing around the subject like it was a live wire. "The Hendersons called last night while you were at the church meeting," she said, settling into her chair. "They want to know if we've made a decision about the foundation work." David's jaw tightened. The fire had damaged more than just the visible structure. The heat had cracked the foundation in several places, and the repairs would cost nearly as much as rebuilding from scratch. Insurance covered most of it, but the emotional toll of watching strangers tear apart what remained of their home felt insurmountable. "What did you tell them?" "That we'd call back." Sarah wrapped her hands around her mug, drawing warmth from the ceramic. "David, we need to talk about what Marcus said." He stood abruptly, carrying his barely touched breakfast to the sink. "There's nothing to talk about. The man's delusional if he thinks we'd let him anywhere near our property." "Is he, though?" The question hung between them like smoke. You should have seen his face when he was talking about his daughter. That kind of pain, you can't fake it. Pain doesn't excuse what he did. David's voice carried an edge she rarely heard. "He destroyed our lives, Sarah. Our home, our sense of safety, everything we'd built together. And now he wants to rebuild it. With what motive? Guilt? Some misguided attempt at redemption?" He turned to face her, and she saw something in his expression that made her stomach clench. People like him don't change. They just find new ways to manipulate. The certainty in his voice surprised her. David had always been the one to see the best in people, to offer second chances even when she counseled caution. This hardness felt foreign, like a stranger wearing her husband's face. "Since when do you speak about anyone with such finality?" He looked away, focusing on something beyond the window. "Since someone tried to burn us alive in our sleep." The words hit her like a physical blow. They'd never spoken so directly about that night, about how close they'd come to not waking up. The smoke detectors had saved them, but barely. Another 10 minutes and the story would have had a very different ending. "I keep thinking about what Bishop Morrison said last Sunday," she said quietly, "about forgiveness being a choice we make for ourselves, not for the person who wronged us." Easy words from someone whose house wasn't torched. "David," her voice carried a warning now, "you're talking about our bishop." "I'm talking about reality." He moved to the window, staring out at the rental house's small backyard, a space so different from the garden they'd cultivated for 15 years. "Some actions have consequences that can't be undone with apologies and good intentions." Sarah joined him at the window, studying his profile. "What aren't you telling me?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. His hands clenched at his sides, and for a moment she thought he might actually answer. Instead, he shook his head. "I'm telling you that we need to focus on moving forward, not looking back. We have insurance money, contractor bids to review, a future to plan. We don't need the complication of Marcus Webb's guilty conscience." But Sarah had caught something in his reaction, a flicker of uncertainty that suggested there was more to his resistance than protective instinct. She'd known David for 22 years, been married to him for 18. She could read the subtle tells that others missed, the way his left hand twitched when he was withholding information, the slight tightening around his eyes when he wasn't being entirely truthful. "I think we should pray about it," she said finally. "We already know what's right, do we?" She touched his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. "Because I'm not sure anymore. And I don't think you are either." Before he could respond, the phone rang. David moved to answer it, his expression grateful for the interruption. Sarah watched him listen to whoever was on the other end, noting how his face gradually paled. "When?" he asked. Then, after a pause, "No, we'll be right there." He hung up slowly, his hand lingering on the receiver. "That was Detective Rodriguez," he said without turning around. "Marcus Webb was arrested last night. They found him at our old property, standing in what used to be our bedroom." The morning light filtered through the kitchen window as Sarah poured coffee with trembling hands. She'd barely slept, her mind replaying every word of yesterday's encounter. David sat across from her, his scriptures open but unread, staring into the distance with the same haunted expression he'd worn since Marcus Webb had walked back into their lives. "The bishop called," David said finally, his voice hoarse. "He wants to meet with us this afternoon." Sarah nodded, unsurprised. Word traveled fast in their tight-knit ward, and someone must have seen Marcus at their door. She wondered what version of the story was already making rounds, how much speculation was building about why the man who'd destroyed their lives had returned. "What will you tell him?" she asked. "Don't know." David closed the scriptures with a soft thud. "What are we supposed to tell him? That the man who burned down our business wants to rebuild it? That he claims he's found God and wants to make amends?" The kitchen fell silent, except for the tick of the wall clock. Sarah thought about the way Marcus had looked at her yesterday, not with the cold calculation she remembered from the trial, but with something that looked almost like genuine remorse. It disturbed her how much she wanted to believe it was real. "Maybe we should hear what the bishop has to say," she ventured. David's laugh was bitter. "I know what he'll say. Forgiveness. Turn the other cheek. Love our enemies." He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Easy words when it's not your life that was destroyed. Sarah watched him pace to the window, his shoulders rigid with tension. The David she'd married had been gentle, quick to forgive, slow to anger. The fire had changed him in ways that went deeper than their financial losses. It had stolen something from his spirit, left him guarded and suspicious in a way that seemed to pain him as much as it did her. "What if he's telling the truth?" she asked quietly. David spun around, his eyes flashing. "Truth? Sarah, this is the man who lied to investigators, who claimed the fire was an accident even when they had evidence it was arson. He only confessed when they had him cornered. People can change, David. Isn't that what we believe? Some people." His voice was flat, "but some people are just good at pretending." The phone rang, cutting through the tension. Sarah answered, recognizing the voice of their insurance adjuster immediately. "Mrs. Hanson? Jim Morrison here. I've got some unusual news. Someone's been asking questions about your old claim, specifically about the building that burned down on Maple Street." Sarah's grip tightened on the receiver. "What kind of questions?" "Property values, current ownership status, rebuilding costs." The caller claimed to represent a potential investor interested in restoration projects in the area. "Thought you should know, given the circumstances of the original loss." After she hung up, Sarah relayed the conversation to David, watching his expression darken with each word. "He's already making moves," David said, "probably trying to figure out how much money he needs to throw at us to make this go away. Or maybe he's serious about rebuilding." David stared at her as if she'd spoken in a foreign language. "You're actually considering this?" It wasn't a question, and Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. Was she? The rational part of her mind screamed warnings, reminded her of sleepless nights and financial ruin, of watching David struggle with depression and anger. But another part, the part that had always believed in second chances, in the possibility of redemption, whispered that maybe, just maybe, something good could come from something so destructive. "I don't know what I'm considering," she admitted. "I just know that carrying this anger for 5 years hasn't made us happy. Maybe it's time to try something different." "Different like what? Like trusting the man who destroyed our lives? Different like seeing what happens if we stop letting him destroy our lives?" The words hung between them, stark and challenging. David opened his mouth to respond, then closed it, something shifting in his expression. Before either could speak again, the doorbell rang. They looked at each other with the same thought. Marcus had returned. But when David opened the door, he found Bishop Reynolds standing on their porch, his kind face creased with concern. "I hope I'm not intruding," the bishop said, "but I felt prompted to come by before our meeting this afternoon. Sometimes these things are better discussed sooner rather than later." David stepped aside to let him in, and Sarah felt a mix of relief and apprehension. Whatever was about to happen, at least they wouldn't face it alone. As Bishop Reynolds settled into their living room, Sarah caught David's eye across the room. For the first time in days, she saw something other than anger there, a flicker of the faith that had once defined him, fragile but present. The morning light filtered through the kitchen window as Sarah poured coffee into 2 mismatched mugs, her hands steadier than they'd been in days. Michael sat at the table, turning pages of scripture with unusual force, the thin paper crackling under his fingers. "He's coming back today," she said, not needing to specify who. Michael's jaw tightened. "I know." They'd agreed to let David help with the reconstruction, though neither could articulate exactly why. The insurance money had come through, the permits were approved, and the foundation had been cleared and repoured. Today would mark the real beginning of rebuilding what he'd destroyed. Sarah carried the mugs to the table and sat across from her husband. "Bishop Morrison called last night while you were out. He wants to meet with us before David starts working." "What did you tell him?" "That we'd think about it." She wrapped her fingers around the warm ceramic. "Michael, what if we're making a mistake? What if this is too much too fast?" He looked up from his scriptures, and she saw something raw in his eyes. "Then we'll deal with it when it happens." "But Sarah, I keep thinking about the atonement, about how Christ descended below all things. If he can forgive everything, who are we to say this is too much?" The theological answer felt thin against the weight of her actual emotions, but she nodded anyway. Through the window she could see their neighbor Mrs. Chen tending her garden, carefully transplanting seedlings that had survived the late frost. Some things could be saved, others had to be started over. At 8:30, a familiar blue pickup truck pulled into their driveway. David climbed out, wearing work clothes that looked too new, like he'd bought them specifically for this job. He stood beside his truck for a long moment, staring at the cleared lot where their home had been, before walking to the front door. Sarah answered his knock, noting how he kept his eyes down. "Morning, Mrs. Parker. I brought the lumber list for you to approve." He handed her a clipboard covered in his careful handwriting. "And I wanted you to know, I understand if you change your mind about this, about me being here. Michael appeared behind her. Come in, David. We should talk. They sat in the living room of the rental house, an awkward triangle of chairs that felt too intimate and too distant at the same time. David perched on the edge of his seat as if ready to bolt. I've been thinking about what you said, Michael began, about making amends. But I need to understand something first. Why did you do it? Really? David's hands clenched in his lap. I was angry, drunk, stupid. He paused, struggling with something deeper. My dad died in a house fire when I was 12. Electrical fault that the insurance company said was preventable. We lost everything, and my mom... He swallowed hard. She never recovered. Spent the next 6 years drinking herself to death while we bounced between relatives who didn't want us. Sarah felt her chest tighten with unexpected sympathy. I know that doesn't excuse what I did, David continued. But when I saw your perfect house, your perfect family, I just snapped. I wanted you to feel what we felt, to lose everything. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of shared pain. And now? Michael asked quietly. Now I realize I was trying to burn down the wrong thing. The problem was never other people's happiness. It was the anger eating me alive. David looked directly at them for the first time. I can't undo what I did, but I can try to build something better in its place. Michael stood and walked to the window, looking out at the empty lot. My father always said that faith without works is dead, that forgiveness isn't just about feeling differently, it's about acting differently. What are you saying? Sarah asked. He turned back to them. I'm saying we all have something to prove here. David has to prove he can create instead of destroy. You and I have to prove we can trust instead of fear. Maybe we're all building more than just a house. David nodded slowly. I won't let you down. I know you have no reason to believe that, but I won't. We'll see, Sarah said, surprised by the honesty in her voice. Day by day, we'll see. They walked outside together, standing at the edge of the foundation like three people at the shore of an uncertain ocean. The concrete was clean and pale in the morning light, waiting for walls and windows and the thousand small decisions that would transform it into a home. David opened the tailgate of his truck and began unloading tools with the careful precision of someone who understood that every action was being measured. Sarah and Michael watched from the porch, two people learning to balance the mathematics of mercy against the gravity of their grief. The work of rebuilding, they realized, had already begun. The fluorescent lights in the police station hummed overhead as Sarah sat across from Detective Martinez, her hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. David paced behind her chair, his footsteps echoing in the sterile room like a metronome, counting down to something inevitable. Mrs. Chen, I need you to walk me through yesterday evening one more time, Martinez said, her pen poised over a yellow notepad. From the moment you first saw Mr. Brennan on your property. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to organize the chaos of memory into something coherent. It was around 6:30. I was cleaning up from dinner when I saw him through the kitchen window. He was just standing there, looking at the foundation where the old house used to be. And you recognized him immediately? The question hung in the air like smoke. Sarah felt David's pacing stop, felt his eyes on the back of her neck. Not immediately, but there was something familiar about the way he stood, the way he held his shoulders. When he turned around, she swallowed hard. I knew those eyes, even after 15 years. Martinez scribbled notes. What did you do then? I called for David, told him to come quickly but quietly. We watched him for maybe 10 minutes before David went outside. Mr. Chen, Martinez turned to David, in your statement, you said Mr. Brennan seemed surprised to see you. Can you elaborate? David finally stopped pacing and pulled out the chair beside Sarah. He looked shocked, actually, like he'd seen a ghost. He kept saying he didn't know we were the ones who lived here now. But that doesn't make sense, does it? I mean, if he was planning to come back, wouldn't he have researched who owned the property? That's what we're trying to determine. Martinez flipped through her notes. Did he say why he came back to Millbrook? Sarah and David exchanged glances. They'd discussed this question until nearly 3 in the morning, dissecting every word of their encounter with Marcus, like investigators themselves. He said he wanted to make things right, Sarah answered, that he'd been carrying the weight of what he did for 15 years and couldn't carry it anymore. Those were his exact words. Close enough. He also said... Sarah hesitated, remembering the raw pain in Marcus's voice. He said he never meant for anyone to get hurt, that the fire was supposed to happen when the house was empty. Martinez looked up sharply. He specifically mentioned the victims? Not by name, but he knew about Mrs. Henderson and her grandson. Sarah's voice cracked slightly. He knew they died because of what he did. The detective made more notes, then leaned back in her chair. Here's what I don't understand. Marcus Brennan served 8 years for second-degree arson. He was released 4 years ago. Why wait until now to make contact? What changed? David rubbed his temples. Maybe he's been working up the courage. 8 years in prison gives a man time to think. Or maybe something triggered this, Martinez countered. A death in the family, a health scare, therapy. People don't usually decide to confront their past without a catalyst. Sarah found herself thinking about Marcus's appearance the night before. He'd looked older than his years, worn down by something heavier than time. There had been a desperation in his eyes that spoke of running out of options, of reaching the end of some internal rope. Detective, Sarah said slowly, what exactly are you investigating? I mean, he already served his time for the arson. Is it illegal for him to contact us? Martinez set down her pen. Mrs. Chen, yesterday evening, someone broke into the offices of Millbrook Development Corporation. Nothing was stolen, but several filing cabinets were searched through. The security footage shows a man matching Mr. Brennan's description leaving the building around 11 p.m. David went still. Millbrook Development. Aren't they the company that's been buying up properties in the old neighborhood? Among other things, yes. The timing of Mr. Brennan's return and this break-in raises questions about his real motives. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. You think he's planning something? Another fire? I think we need to find him and ask him directly. Martinez closed her notepad. Which brings me to my next question. Has he tried to contact you since yesterday? No, David answered quickly. Too quickly. Martinez studied his face. Mr. Chen, if Mr. Brennan does reach out, you need to call us immediately. Don't try to handle this on your own. The man has a history of violence, regardless of his apparent remorse. Sarah nodded, but her mind was already elsewhere, thinking about second chances and the weight of forgiveness. Somewhere in Millbrook, Marcus Brennan was carrying 15 years of guilt and searching for something that might not exist. The question was whether he was looking for redemption or revenge, and whether there was any real difference between the two. The morning light filtered through the kitchen window as Sarah poured coffee with trembling hands. 3 days had passed since Marcus's revelation, and the weight of his confession had settled into every corner of their home like smoke that wouldn't clear. David sat across from her at the breakfast table, his jaw tight with the kind of tension that had become their new normal. The insurance investigator called yesterday, David said, not looking up from his untouched eggs. They're reopening the case. Sarah's cup clinked against the saucer. Did you tell them about Marcus? No. The word hung between them like an accusation. But I should have. She studied her husband's face, searching for the man who had once believed so deeply in the power of forgiveness that he'd built their entire marriage on that foundation. Now she saw only the rigid lines of someone wrestling with principles that no longer seemed to fit. He's trying to make amends, David. Isn't that what we've always taught the kids? That people can change? David's laugh was bitter. Change. Sarah, he destroyed everything we built. Our home, my father's workshop, 20 years of memories. And now he shows up with lumber and good intentions, thinking that makes it even? The sound of hammering drifted through the window. Marcus had been working since dawn, framing what would become their new bedroom. Sarah had watched him from the kitchen window, noting the careful precision of his movements, the way he double-checked every measurement. There was something almost reverent in how he handled the wood. "Maybe it's not about making it even," Sarah said quietly. "Maybe it's about something else." Before David could respond, Emma bounded into the kitchen, her backpack slung over one shoulder. At 16, their daughter had inherited David's stubbornness and Sarah's intuition in equal measure. "Is that man still here?" Emma asked, grabbing an apple from the counter. "His name is Marcus," Sarah said. "And yes, he's helping us rebuild." Emma's eyes flicked between her parents, reading the tension with the acute awareness of a teenager who, grown up in a house where difficult conversations were conducted in whispered tones after bedtime. "Jess's mom says he's the one who burned our house down," Emma said, her voice carefully neutral. "She says you're crazy for letting him come back." David's fork clattered against his plate. "What else is Jess's mom saying? That you've lost your minds, that he could do it again." "That—" Emma stopped, catching the look on her mother's face. Sarah closed her eyes. She'd known the talk would start eventually. Cedar Falls was too small for secrets, especially ones this complicated. By now, half the town probably knew Marcus's identity, and the other half would know by evening. "What do you think, Em?" David asked, his voice softer now. "About second chances?" Emma considered this with the seriousness she applied to everything important. "I think," she said slowly, "that forgiveness is supposed to be hard. Otherwise, everyone would do it." After Emma left for school, Sarah found herself standing in the doorway of what had been their living room. The skeleton of new walls was taking shape, and she could see Marcus through the plastic sheeting that separated the construction zone from the rest of the house. He was alone, measuring a piece of drywall with the focused intensity of someone trying to get something exactly right. She stepped into the space, debris crunching under her feet. Marcus looked up, his face streaked with dust and sweat. "Mrs. Chen, I didn't hear you come in." "Sarah," she corrected automatically. "We've been through this." He nodded, but she could see the discomfort in his shoulders, the way he held himself apart even in conversation. This was a man who'd learned not to expect kindness. "The insurance investigator called," she said, watching his reaction. Marcus went very still. "I see. They're reopening the case. David hasn't told them about you yet, but—" She let the sentence hang. "But he should." Marcus set down his measuring tape. "I've been thinking about that myself, about coming forward." "What stopped you?" Marcus gestured at the half-built walls around them. "Wanted to get this done first. Figured I owed you that much before—" He shrugged. "Before whatever comes next." Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of the man who'd been angry enough to destroy their lives. All she saw was exhaustion and something that might have been hope, fragile as new drywall. "Why did you really come back, Marcus?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I've been carrying this house around in my head for 5 years. Every beam I burned, every room I destroyed. I know this place better than anywhere I've ever lived." He looked directly at her then. "I thought maybe if I could rebuild it, I could rebuild myself too." The honesty in his words hit her like a physical blow. Sarah realized that somewhere in the last few days, she'd stopped seeing Marcus as the enemy and started seeing him as something much more complicated, a broken man trying to piece together more than just their home. The manila envelope felt heavier than it should have as Sarah set it on the kitchen table. Marcus stood behind her, his hand resting on her shoulder, both of them staring at the contents. Detective Rodriguez had left with them an hour earlier. Crime scene photographs, police reports, witness statements, everything the department had compiled about the fire that had consumed their lives 3 years ago. "We don't have to look at these," Marcus said quietly. "We already know what happened." But Sarah was already reaching for the first photograph, her fingers trembling slightly. The image showed their house as she'd never wanted to see it again, a blackened skeleton against the dawn sky, windows blown out like hollow eyes, the roof collapsed into the second floor where Emma's nursery had been. She set it aside and picked up another. This one showed the front yard, littered with debris and crossed with yellow tape. In the corner, barely visible, she could make out Marcus kneeling on the sidewalk, his face buried in his hands, while a paramedic tried to examine the burns on his arms. "Sarah, I need to see." Her voice was steady, but Marcus could see the tension in her jaw. "I need to understand what drove him to come back." The next photograph made her breath catch. It was taken from inside what had been their living room, looking toward the staircase. The wooden banister they'd refinished together during their first year of marriage was charred beyond recognition. The family photos that had lined the wall were nothing but twisted frames and ash. Marcus pulled out a chair and sat beside her. "Rodriguez said they're reopening the investigation, looking into whether there were other fires we didn't know about." Sarah nodded, remembering the detective's words. "Jake isn't the first person to return to make amends," she had said. "But he's the first one where the victims have been willing to listen. That makes him either genuinely changed or very, very good at manipulation." The police report was clinical in its language, but the facts still hit like physical blows. Accelerant found in multiple locations. Evidence of forced entry through the back door. The fire set deliberately in 3 separate areas to ensure maximum damage and prevent escape routes. "He wanted to kill us," Sarah whispered, the words hanging in the air between them. Marcus reached for her hand. "But we survived." "Barely." She turned to a witness statement from Mrs. Chen next door. The elderly woman had been up late with her sick grandchild when she saw someone running from their backyard. Her description matched Jake perfectly. Tall, thin, wearing dark clothes and moving with the quick, nervous energy of someone fleeing a crime. Sarah flipped through more pages. Insurance documents, fire department reports, a psychological profile commissioned by the prosecution that painted Jake as a textbook pyromaniac with antisocial tendencies and a high likelihood of reoffending. "Look at this," Marcus said, pointing to a section of the investigative report she'd missed. They found evidence he'd been watching the house for weeks before the fire. Cigarette butts across the street with his DNA, footprints in the garden that matched his shoes. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. The random act of violence she'd imagined was anything but random. Jake had chosen them deliberately, studied them, planned their deaths with careful precision. "Why us?" she asked. "We'd never even met him." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, studying another document. When he looked up, his face was troubled. "Sarah, what if we had met him? What if we just don't remember?" She frowned. "What do you mean?" He pointed to a background check in Jake's file. He worked construction for Morrison and Sons. That's the company that built the Henderson's addition 2 doors down. Remember how long that project took? All summer, the year before the fire. Workers parked on our street every day. Sarah felt a flicker of memory. She had been pregnant then, working from home during her difficult first trimester. There had been construction noise constantly, trucks blocking their driveway, workers asking to use their water spigot. "You think he knew us before he decided to?" "I think maybe we complained about the noise, or refused to let them use our electricity. Or maybe you were just friendly to him and he misinterpreted it." Marcus's voice was getting tighter. "Maybe this wasn't random at all. Maybe we did something, said something, that made him choose us." The possibility hung between them like smoke. Sarah tried to remember specific faces from that summer, specific interactions, but pregnancy brain and the passage of time had blurred the details into impressions of heat and noise and exhaustion. Her phone buzzed with a text message. "Jake, I know you're reading about what I did. I know how it looks. But there's more to the story. Can we meet tomorrow? I need to tell you everything, including the part about Emma." Sarah's blood turned to ice. Marcus read over her shoulder, his grip on her hand tightening until it hurt. Emma. Their daughter's name in the mouth of her would-be killer. Some truths, Sarah realized, were more terrifying than ignorance. The sound of hammering echoed through the morning air as David worked on the porch railing, each strike precise and measured. Sarah watched from the kitchen window, noting how his movements had changed over the past weeks, less frantic, more purposeful. The desperate energy that had driven him to their doorstep had transformed into something steadier, though she couldn't shake the feeling that beneath the surface, storms still churned. Marcus emerged from the house carrying 2 cups of coffee, his limp more pronounced in the cold morning air. The physical therapy sessions were helping, but progress came slowly, each step a reminder of that night when everything changed. "He's good with his hands," Marcus said, settling beside Sarah at the window. "Better than most contractors I've seen." Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully, inhaling the steam. "That's what worries me sometimes. How someone so skilled at building could have been so determined to destroy." They stood in comfortable silence, watching David measure twice before making each cut. The porch was taking shape beautifully, each board fitted with care that spoke of genuine craftsmanship rather than mere obligation. "Detective Morrison called this morning," Marcus said quietly. "While you were in the shower." Sarah's grip tightened on her mug. What did she want? "There's been another fire. Downtown warehouse district. Same accelerant pattern." Marcus paused, studying David's profile through the glass. She wanted to know where David was last night. The implications hit Sarah like cold water. She still thinks she's doing her job, following patterns. Marcus turned away from the window. "I told her he was here, helped me with my exercises around 9, then we watched the late news together." Relief flooded through Sarah, followed immediately by guilt at feeling relieved. 6 months ago, she would never have imagined providing an alibi for an arsonist. Now it felt as natural as breathing. David looked up suddenly, as if sensing their scrutiny, and waved. His smile was genuine, transforming his weathered features. Sarah found herself waving back automatically. "Sometimes I wonder if we're the ones being redeemed," she murmured. Marcus nodded slowly. Forgiveness changes the forgiver as much as the forgiven. The phone rang, interrupting their quiet moment. Sarah answered to find an unfamiliar voice, gruff and demanding. "This is Bill Henley from the Tribune. I'm working on a story about David Cole, and understand he's staying with you folks. Mind if I ask a few questions?" Sarah's blood chilled. "I'm sorry, but we don't have any comment." "Come on, Mrs. Richardson. The public has a right to know. An arsonist living in a residential neighborhood working on houses? People are concerned. Mr. Cole has paid his debt to society. He's trying to rebuild his life. By rebuilding what he burned down. That's quite a story. Human interest angle, you know. Redemption, second chances. Could be good for everyone involved." Sarah hung up without another word, her hands trembling. Marcus took one look at her face and reached for his jacket. "I'll talk to David. He needs to know." Outside, the hammering had stopped. David was examining a board with intense concentration, running his fingers along the grain. He looked up as Marcus approached, immediately sensing the shift in atmosphere. "What's wrong?" Reporter called, asking questions. Marcus kept his voice low, aware that sound carried in the quiet neighborhood. "And there was another fire last night, downtown." David's face went ashen. He set down the board carefully, his movements suddenly deliberate and controlled. "Morrison will want to talk to me again. We'll tell her you were with us, because you were." "That's not the point." David sank onto the porch steps, his head in his hands. "Don't you see? It's never going to end. Every fire, every suspicious flame, and I'll be the first suspect. You'll be questioned, your neighbors will whisper, and eventually," he looked up, eyes hollow, "eventually you'll wonder too. In the dark moments, when doubt creeps in, you'll wonder if the man sleeping in your guest room really changed, or if he's just better at hiding it." Marcus lowered himself carefully onto the step beside David. "Faith isn't the absence of doubt. It's choosing to believe despite it. And when the next fire happens, and the one after that, then we'll face those moments when they come." Marcus's voice was steady. "But we won't let fear of tomorrow steal the grace of today." A car pulled into the driveway, Detective Morrison's unmarked sedan. David stood slowly, squaring his shoulders like a man preparing for battle. "Mr. Cole," Morrison called out, approaching with her notebook already in hand. I need to ask you about your whereabouts last night between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. He was here, Marcus said firmly. With us. All night. Morrison's gaze shifted between the two men, noting their protective stance, the way Marcus had positioned himself slightly in front of David. She'd seen this dynamic before, families closing ranks, truth bending to accommodate loyalty. I'll need to verify that with Mrs. Richardson as well, she said. And I'll be checking with your neighbors. Someone might have noticed if anyone left the house during those hours. David nodded, accepting the scrutiny with quiet dignity. I understand you're doing your job, detective, but the only fire I'm interested in now is the one that builds, not the kind that destroys. The courthouse steps felt like ice beneath Sarah's feet, even through her winter boots. She watched Daniel emerge from the revolving doors, his shoulders set with the same determination that had carried him through their sleepless nights of discussion. The plea hearing had lasted only 20 minutes, but those 20 minutes had changed everything. It's done, Daniel said quietly, his breath forming small clouds in the January air. Marcus accepted the plea. 5 years with possibility of parole in 3. Sarah nodded, though something hollow echoed in her chest. Justice. This was supposed to feel like justice. Instead, she felt only the weight of Marcus's eyes when he'd turned to look at them before being led away in handcuffs. The gratitude there had been almost unbearable. The DA seemed pleased, Daniel continued, adjusting his tie against the wind, said it was the right outcome, accountability without destroying his future completely. They walked toward their car in silence, passing clusters of reporters who had grown bored with the story weeks ago. The media attention had faded once it became clear there would be no dramatic trial, no explosive revelations, just a young man who had made a terrible mistake and a family choosing to show mercy within the bounds of law. Rebecca wants us to come for dinner tonight, Sarah said, as Daniel started the engine. She thinks we need family around us. Maybe she's right. Daniel's voice carried an exhaustion that sleep couldn't cure. Though I'm not sure I'm ready for everyone's opinions about what we should be feeling. Sarah understood. Their decision to support a plea deal rather than push for the maximum sentence had divided their community. Some praised their Christian forgiveness, others questioned whether mercy without full punishment truly served justice. The bishop had counseled them that there was no single right answer, that they had to find their own path through the wilderness of grief and choice. As they drove through town, Sarah noticed the construction crew working on the Henderson property. The foundation was nearly complete, the concrete pale and clean against the blackened earth that hadn't yet been cleared away. Marcus had insisted the insurance money go toward rebuilding, even knowing he wouldn't be there to see it finished. Tom Henderson called this morning, Daniel said, following her gaze. They want to know if we'd like to plant a memorial garden on the south side of the new house. For Emma. Sarah's throat tightened. Emma's name still felt like a stone in her chest, smooth and heavy from constant handling. What did you tell him? That we'd think about it. Daniel slowed as they passed the site. He said Marcus drew up the plans before the sentencing, wanted roses and that purple sage Emma always picked when she was little. The detail hit Sarah unexpectedly. Marcus remembered Emma's favorite wildflower. Of course he did. He'd spent 3 years observing their family, learning their habits, their joys, their vulnerabilities. The knowledge that had enabled his crime had also preserved these small intimacies. I keep thinking about his mother, Sarah admitted, how she looked when they read the sentence. Like she was drowning. Daniel reached across the console to take her hand. You can't carry everyone's pain, Sarah. You've got enough of your own. But that was the problem. Somewhere in the maze of legal proceedings and moral questioning, her own grief had become entangled with Marcus's fate. She grieved for Emma, yes, but she also grieved for the boy who had set that fire, for the circumstances that had driven him to such desperation, for the future he'd traded away in a moment of panic and rage. Detective Morrison said Marcus wants to write us a letter, Daniel said carefully. From prison. She wanted to know if we'd be willing to receive it. Sarah stared out the passenger window at the familiar streets of their town, the same route she'd driven with Emma countless times. Everything looked the same. but the geography of their life had been redrawn completely. "Do you think forgiveness is supposed to hurt this much?" she asked. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. "Maybe that's how you know it's real. If it were easy, it wouldn't mean anything." They pulled into their driveway, and Sarah saw the small pile of mail by their front door. More sympathy cards, probably, or bills related to Emma's memorial service. The mundane business of life after loss, paperwork that couldn't account for the size of absence in their home. "About the letter," Sarah said as Daniel turned off the engine. "I think we should read it, when he's ready to send it." Daniel studied her face. "Are you sure?" Sarah wasn't sure of anything anymore, but she was learning that uncertainty wasn't the same as wrong. Sometimes you had to walk forward into the darkness, trusting that your feet would find solid ground. "Emma would have wanted us to listen," she said finally. "She always believed people could change." The wind picked up, scattering the last autumn leaves that had clung stubbornly to the oak tree in their front yard. Winter was coming, but spring would follow. It always did. The morning light filtered through the kitchen window as Sarah spread the insurance documents across the table, each page a reminder of what they'd lost. The final settlement had arrived yesterday, enough to rebuild, enough to start over, but the money felt cold in her hands, tainted by the knowledge of who had lit the match. David stood at the counter, coffee growing cold in his mug as he stared out at the blackened remains of their barn. 3 weeks had passed since Marcus confessed, since their world shifted on its axis. The police had taken his statement, the lawyers had filed their papers, and now they waited for the wheels of justice to turn. "The contractor called," Sarah said without looking up. "He can start next month if we give him the go-ahead." David nodded but didn't turn around. They'd been having the same conversation for days, dancing around the real question that hung between them like smoke. What did forgiveness actually look like when the person who hurt you was trying to make amends? The sound of tires on gravel interrupted the heavy silence. Through the window, Sarah watched Marcus climb out of his truck, tool belt hanging from his shoulder. He'd been coming by every morning for a week, working on smaller repairs around the property without being asked, fixing fence posts, clearing debris, preparing the foundation where the new barn would stand. "He's here again," she said. David finally turned, his jaw tight. "I know." They watched Marcus walk to the burn site and begin working, his movements methodical and determined. There was something different about him now, something broken open that let the light in. But Sarah couldn't shake the image of him running from their property that night, couldn't forget the smell of gasoline and fear. A knock at the back door made them both freeze. Marcus stood on their porch, hat in his hands, looking smaller somehow than the man who'd terrorized their dreams. David opened the door but didn't invite him in. "I wanted to talk to you both," Marcus said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "About the money." "What about it?" Sarah asked, joining David in the doorway. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded check. "I've been working extra jobs, sold some things. It's not much compared to what you lost, but it's a start." He held out the check with trembling fingers. "I want to pay for the rebuild myself. Every dollar." Sarah stared at the check. $5,000 made out in David's name. It wouldn't cover a quarter of the construction costs, but she could see in Marcus's hollow eyes that it represented everything he had. "We can't take this," David said quietly. "Please." Marcus's voice cracked. "I need to do this. I need to make it right." "Making it right means facing the consequences," Sarah said, surprised by the sharpness in her own voice. "It means accepting responsibility in court, not just playing handyman around our property." Marcus flinched as if she'd struck him. "I know I deserve whatever punishment comes, but right now, today, I need to work. I need to build something instead of burning it down." The three of them stood in uncomfortable silence, the weight of unspoken truths pressing down like summer heat. Sarah could see David wrestling with himself, torn between the anger that had sustained him for months and the compassion their faith demanded. "The police want to know if we'll testify at the sentencing hearing," David said finally. "If we'll make a victim impact statement." Marcus nodded, his face pale but resolute. "You should. You should tell them everything, about the fear, about what I stole from you, all of it. Something shifted in Sarah's chest, a loosening she hadn't expected. This wasn't the same man who'd run from their property in panic. This was someone who'd looked into his own darkness and chosen to step toward the light, even knowing it would burn. "Keep your money," she heard herself saying. "But if you really want to help rebuild, then show up, every day. Work beside the contractors, learn what it means to create something lasting." Marcus's eyes filled with tears. "I will. I promise." David looked at his wife in surprise, but slowly nodded his agreement. "The hearing is next month. We'll tell our truth, and you'll tell yours. After that," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "after that we figure out what comes next." As Marcus walked back to his truck, check still clutched in his hand, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since the night of the fire. Not quite peace, but possibility, the kind that only comes when people choose the harder path, when they decide that healing matters more than being right. The barn would rise again, board by board, nail by nail, and maybe in the building of it, they'd all discover what redemption actually looked like, when it walked on calloused hands and wore work boots, when it showed up every morning despite the weight of what couldn't be undone. The sound of breaking glass shattered the pre-dawn quiet, followed by Sarah's scream from downstairs. David bolted upright, his heart hammering as he recognized the crash of their front window. Through the bedroom curtains, orange light flickered against the walls, not the gentle glow of sunrise, but something urgent and wrong. "Stay here," he commanded Sarah, but she was already pulling on her robe, her face pale in the dim light. They rushed down the stairs together, David grabbing the baseball bat from the hall closet. In the living room, shards of glass littered the hardwood floor around a brick wrapped in paper. Through the broken window, they could see a small fire burning on their front lawn, not threatening the house, but clearly intentional. David's hands shook as he unwrapped the paper from the brick. "G-E-T, out while you can," was scrawled across it in block letters. Sarah moved to the window, careful to avoid the glass. "David, look." Across the street, Mrs. Henderson stood on her porch in her nightgown, arms crossed, watching them with undisguised satisfaction. When she noticed Sarah looking, she turned and went back inside, slamming her door. "I'm calling the police," Sarah said, reaching for her phone. "Wait." David caught her wrist gently. "We need to talk to Marcus first. If this escalates, if they arrest someone in the neighborhood, it could destroy everything he's worked for. David, someone just threw a brick through our window and set a fire on our lawn. At what point do we stop protecting everyone else and start protecting ourselves?" Before he could answer, another vehicle pulled up outside. David tensed, gripping the bat tighter, but it was Marcus's truck. Marcus climbed out slowly, surveying the damage, then walked through their front gate as David opened the door. "I saw the smoke from my apartment," Marcus said quietly. "Mrs. Patterson called me. She saw teenagers running from your yard about 10 minutes ago." "Teenagers?" Sarah's voice was sharp. "Or neighbors who've decided we're not welcome anymore?" Marcus looked at the brick in David's hands, his jaw tightening as he read the message. "This is my fault. I should have seen this coming." "It's not your fault," David said automatically, but even as he spoke, he felt something shifting inside him, a growing anger that had been building for weeks. "Although maybe if you'd been more careful about being seen here—" "David," Sarah warned. "No, I'm tired of walking on eggshells. We've lost friends, our kids are afraid to play outside, and now this." He gestured at the broken window. "All because we chose to forgive you, and apparently that makes us the enemy." Marcus stepped closer, his voice urgent. "Let me fix this. I can find out who did this, talk to them." "How?" "By going door to door, asking people to confess? That'll just make things worse." David ran his hands through his hair, feeling trapped. "Maybe we made a mistake. Maybe some things can't be forgiven without consequences we're not prepared to face." The words hung in the air like smoke. Sarah stared at her husband, and Marcus took a step back as if he'd been physically struck. "You don't mean that," Sarah said softly. But David wasn't sure anymore. The theoretical beauty of forgiveness was crumbling against the practical reality of living with its aftermath. Every day brought new challenges, suspicious looks, whispered conversations that stopped when they approached, their children asking why their friends couldn't come over anymore. I'm tired of being punished for doing what we thought was right, he said finally. Marcus picked up a piece of glass from the floor, turning it over in his hands. I can leave, tonight. Just disappear. It would solve everyone's problems. Running away again? The bitterness in David's voice surprised even him. That's your solution to everything, isn't it? Burn it down or run away. David, stop! Sarah moved between them. This isn't who we are, isn't it? How do we know who we are until we're tested like this? David looked at his wife, then at Marcus. I thought forgiveness would set us free, but it feels like we're more trapped than ever. Marcus set the glass shard carefully on the coffee table. You're right. I was selfish to come back. I thought I could make things right, but all I've done is make your life harder. Some debts can't be repaid. He moved toward the door, but Sarah called after him. Marcus, wait! She looked at David, her eyes reflecting the orange glow from outside, where the small fire was finally dying out. We're all afraid right now. Afraid we made the wrong choice, afraid of what comes next. But fear can't be what decides this. David stared at the broken glass, the brick, the evidence of how their choice had divided their community. In the growing light of dawn, everything looked different, harsher, more complicated than it had seemed in the comfortable certainty of their initial decision to forgive. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. The morning light filtered through the courthouse windows as Sarah adjusted her collar for the third time. Beside her, David's hands remained folded in his lap, steady and still in a way that somehow made her more nervous. They'd been here before, different building, different state, but the same suffocating weight of testimony hanging in the air. Detective Morrison approached their bench, her expression unreadable. The defense is asking for character witnesses, people who can speak to his rehabilitation, his work in the community. She paused, studying their faces. They want you both. Sarah's stomach dropped. For Marcus? His lawyer thinks your forgiveness carries weight. A Mormon couple whose home he burned, now willing to vouch for his character. Morrison's tone suggested what she thought of that strategy. You don't have to do it. David finally looked up. What would we say? The truth, I suppose, whatever you think that is. Morrison's radio crackled, and she glanced at it impatiently. There's something else. We found accelerant residue in his truck, fresh, from 3 days ago. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. 3 days ago, Marcus had been at their dinner table, helping Emma with her math homework. 3 days ago, she'd watched him teach their son how to properly measure lumber for the garden box they were building together. You're sure? David's voice was barely above a whisper. Lab confirmed it twice. Same chemical signature as the fires from 8 years ago. Morrison leaned closer. We think he might be setting fires to put them out, some kind of hero complex, creating situations where he can save the day. Sarah's mind raced through the past months. The community center fire that Marcus had spotted first, calling it in before anyone else noticed. The abandoned warehouse blaze where he'd somehow arrived before the fire department, helping evacuate nearby residents. She'd thought it was Providence. God putting him in the right place at the right time to make amends. Has anyone been hurt? David asked. Not yet. But it's escalating. The fires are getting bigger. Morrison straightened. We need to bring him in today, before tonight's community meeting. The community meeting. Sarah had forgotten. The whole neighborhood was gathering to celebrate the completion of the recreation center rebuild, Marcus's project. The culmination of everything he'd worked toward since his return. He'll be there, Sarah said quietly. At the meeting. He's been planning it for weeks. Morrison nodded. We'll take him then. Quietly, if possible. Less traumatic for everyone involved. She hesitated. I'm sorry. I know this isn't what you wanted to hear. As Morrison walked away, Sarah felt David's hand find hers. His palm was warm, steady, but she could feel the tremor in his fingers. "I believed him," she whispered. "I really believed he'd changed." "Maybe he has. Maybe this is just—" David stopped, unable to finish the thought. What was this? Another manifestation of the same sickness that had driven Marcus to burn their home, or something else entirely? A desperate attempt to rewrite history, to become the savior instead of the destroyer. "The kids adore him," Sarah continued, her voice breaking. "Emma talks about him constantly, and James has been so much happier since Marcus started working with him on those building projects." David was quiet for a long moment. Around them, the courthouse buzzed with the quiet efficiency of justice grinding forward. Lawyers shuffled papers, families whispered in corners, bailiffs checked doors. "Do you remember what Bishop Hendrick said?" David finally asked. "About forgiveness being something we do for ourselves, not for them?" Sarah nodded, though she wasn't sure she understood it any better now than she had then. "I think I've been forgiving the wrong person," David said. "I kept forgiving Marcus for what he did to us. But I never forgave myself for not seeing it coming, for not protecting our family better." The realization hit Sarah with unexpected force. She'd been carrying the same weight, the same sense that she should have known, should have seen the signs, should have done something different. Forgiving Marcus had been easier than forgiving herself. "And now?" she asked. "Now I don't know what to think. If he's still setting fires—" David shook his head. "Is that the same man who helped rebuild our home? Who's been mentoring our children?" Through the courthouse windows, Sarah could see people beginning to gather in the square across the street. Early arrivals for tonight's community meeting, probably wanting to get a good look at the completed recreation center in daylight. She spotted Mrs. Chen setting up folding chairs, and the Rodriguez family laying out a picnic blanket. It should have been a celebration. Instead, it would be the night Marcus was arrested again, in front of everyone who'd believed in his redemption, in front of the children who'd come to trust him. "We have to be there," Sarah said, though the thought made her sick. "Whatever happens tonight, we have to be there." The morning light filtered through the kitchen window as Sarah poured coffee with trembling hands. 3 days had passed since Michael's arrest. 3 days since their world had shifted once again. The newspaper lay folded on the counter, its headlines screaming about the fugitive arsonist finally captured, but she couldn't bring herself to read the details. David sat at the table, his phone pressed to his ear as he spoke in hushed tones with their bishop. The conversation had been going on for 20 minutes, and Sarah could tell from his posture that it wasn't going well. The ward was divided. Some members couldn't understand how they'd harbored a criminal, while others questioned why they'd turned him in at all. "Yes, Bishop, I understand the concern," David was saying. "But we did what we felt was right." Sarah set his coffee down harder than necessary, causing him to look up. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of their decision etched in the lines around his mouth. They'd both aged years in the past week. When David finally ended the call, the silence stretched between them like a chasm. "They want us to meet with the stake president," he said quietly. "About what? We haven't done anything wrong." "Haven't we?" David's voice carried a bitterness she'd never heard before. "We harbored a fugitive. We let our children get attached to him. He stopped, running his hands through his hair. "I keep wondering if we made the right choice." Sarah sat across from him, reaching for his hands. "You were ready to let him disappear. I'm the one who insisted we call the police. Because I asked you to choose. I put that burden on you." David's grip tightened. "What kind of husband does that make me?" Before Sarah could respond, the doorbell rang. They exchanged glances. Few people had visited since the news broke. Sarah opened the door to find Detective Martinez, but her expression was different from the last time they'd met. Less official, more troubled. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm sorry to bother you. Could I come in for a moment?" They gathered in the living room, the detective declining Sarah's offer of coffee. Martinez pulled out a manila folder, setting it on the coffee table between them. "I wanted to update you on Michael's case before you heard it elsewhere," she began. "His lawyer is pushing for a plea deal." "What kind of deal?" David asked. Reduced charges in exchange for testimony about other arsons in the area. Turns out Michael might not have been working alone back then. Martinez paused. There's something else. The fire that killed his family. We've reopened that investigation. Sarah felt her breath catch. What do you mean? New evidence suggests it might not have been accidental. Michael's been insisting for years that someone else set that fire, but no one listened because of his history. Martinez leaned forward. If he's right, if someone else killed his family and let him take the blame, then he's been carrying guilt that isn't his, David finished. Partly, yes. He still committed the other arsons. But the one that destroyed his life, the one that sent him running, that might have been someone else's crime. The room fell silent as they absorbed this revelation. Sarah thought about Michael's breakdown in their kitchen, his desperate insistence that he'd never meant to hurt anyone. What if he'd been telling more truth than they'd realized? There's more, Martinez continued. Michael asked me to give you this. She handed Sarah an envelope, her name written in Michael's careful script. With shaking fingers, Sarah opened it and read aloud. Dear Sarah and David, I know you'll never forgive me for lying to you, and I don't expect you to. But I need you to know that the time I spent with your family was the closest I've come to peace in 15 years. You showed me what I'd lost, and what I might have been if I'd made different choices. The work we did on your house, that was real. The man you came to know, he was real too, just buried under years of guilt and running. I'm not asking for forgiveness, just understanding. Please tell Emma and Jake that Mr. Michael will always remember building that treehouse, and that some things, once built with love, can never really be destroyed. Thank you for showing me home again, even if I can't stay. Michael. Sarah's voice broke on the last words, tears blurring her vision. David moved to sit beside her, pulling her close as Detective Martinez gathered her papers. For what it's worth, the detective said softly, I think you did the right thing, both in helping him and in turning him in. Sometimes there isn't a perfect choice, just the choice you can live with. After Martinez left, Sarah and David sat in the quiet house, processing everything they'd learned. The man they'd known as Michael Reeves was more complicated than either angel or demon. He was simply human, broken, seeking redemption, carrying burdens that weren't entirely his own. What do we tell the children? Sarah whispered. David held her tighter. The truth, that sometimes the right thing and the hard thing are exactly the same. The courthouse steps felt like an altar beneath Sarah's feet, each stone worn smooth by countless souls seeking justice or redemption. She clutched the manila envelope containing her victim impact statement, the words she'd rewritten a dozen times, still feeling inadequate. Beside her, David's hand found hers, their fingers interlacing in a grip that spoke of shared resolve and lingering uncertainty. Marcus Chen emerged from a black sedan, flanked by his attorney and a small group Sarah didn't recognize. His hair had grown longer during the months of legal proceedings, softening the sharp angles of his face. When their eyes met across the courthouse plaza, he offered the slightest nod. Not acknowledgement of guilt, but of presence, of showing up. Mrs. Campbell? The prosecutor, Jennifer Reyes, appeared at Sarah's elbow. Her navy suit was immaculate, her expression carefully neutral. Are you ready for this? Sarah nodded, though ready felt like the wrong word. You couldn't be ready for something like this, could only walk through it with whatever grace you could muster. Inside, the courtroom's oak paneling absorbed sound and light, creating an atmosphere of solemn gravity. Sarah and David took their seats behind the prosecutor's table, close enough to smell the leather of legal briefs and the faint cologne of the court reporter. The gallery filled slowly. Neighbors, members of their ward, a few journalists whose presence made Sarah's stomach tighten. Judge Patricia Valdez entered with practiced efficiency, her robes billowing as she settled into the bench. Sarah had researched her extensively, a fair jurist with a reputation for thoughtful sentencing, a mother of 3 who'd lost her own home to a wildfire 5 years earlier. In the matter of the state versus Marcus Andrew Chen, the judge began, we're here for sentencing, following the defendant's guilty plea to charges of arson in the second degree, insurance fraud, and filing false police reports. The words hung in the air like smoke. Marcus stood beside his attorney, hands clasped behind his back, posture straight but not defiant. Sarah studied his profile, searching for signs of the man who'd lived in their garage, who'd helped David repair the garden gate, who'd sat at their dinner table and listened to Miriam practice piano. "The court will hear victim impact statements," Judge Valdez announced. "Mrs. Campbell?" Sarah's legs felt disconnected from her body as she approached the podium. The microphone caught her first breath, amplifying the tremor she'd hoped to hide. She unfolded her statement, the paper rustling in the hushed courtroom. "Your Honor, my name is Sarah Campbell. On March 15th, Marcus Chen burned down my house." She paused, letting the simple fact settle. "He destroyed photo albums containing the only pictures of my late mother. He destroyed my children's artwork, my grandmother's quilts, 23 years of accumulated memories and meaning." From the corner of her eye, she saw Marcus's shoulders tense. "But that's not the worst of what he took from us. He took our sense of safety, our ability to trust our own instincts. For months, we questioned everything, every friendship, every kind gesture, every person who asked for help. He turned our faith in humanity into a weapon against us." Sarah's voice grew stronger as she continued. "Yet I stand before you today not seeking vengeance, but accountability. Marcus Chen showed us something profound in the weeks after he destroyed our home. He showed us that people can change, that redemption is possible, that the worst thing someone has done doesn't have to define who they become." She looked directly at Marcus now. His eyes were bright with unshed tears. "My faith teaches me that forgiveness isn't about forgetting or excusing harm. It's about choosing not to let that harm poison your own heart. I forgive Marcus Chen for what he did to my family. But forgiveness doesn't eliminate consequences. True redemption requires both accountability and grace." Sarah folded her statement. "I ask that you sentence him to serve time, Your Honor, but also that you give him the opportunity to make amends through community service, specifically helping other fire victims rebuild their lives. Let him transform his capacity for destruction into a force for healing." The courtroom was silent as Sarah returned to her seat. David squeezed her hand, his own eyes wet. When called upon, Marcus spoke without notes, his voice steady but raw. "I have no excuse for what I did. I was drowning in debt and despair, and I chose to solve my problems by destroying other people's lives. The Campbells showed me kindness when I least deserved it, and I repaid them with betrayal." He turned toward Sarah and David. "I know I can't undo the harm I've caused, but I promise you, and I promise this court, that I will spend whatever time I have left making amends. Not because a judge ordered it, but because it's what redemption requires." Judge Valdez considered silently, her fingers steepled before her. When she finally spoke, her words would reshape all their lives once again. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window as Sarah packed the last of their belongings into cardboard boxes. 3 weeks had passed since the trial, and the house felt different now. Not just because of the repairs Marcus had completed, but because of what had transpired within its walls. The charred beams had been replaced, the smoke-stained walls painted fresh white, yet something fundamental had shifted that no amount of reconstruction could address. David sat at the kitchen table, sorting through insurance papers and legal documents. His movements were deliberate, methodical, but Sarah could see the tremor in his hands that hadn't been there before. The trial had taken something from both of them, though neither spoke of it directly. "The Hendersons said we could stay as long as we need," Sarah said, folding their temple clothes into tissue paper, "until we decide what comes next." David nodded without looking up. They'd been having this same careful conversation for days, dancing around the real question whether their marriage could survive, what they'd learned about themselves in those courtroom hours. The forgiveness they'd extended to Marcus had come easier than forgiving each other for the secrets they'd kept, the judgments they'd harbored, the ways they'd failed each other when the flames came too close. A knock at the door interrupted the heavy silence. Sarah opened it to find Marcus standing on their porch, work clothes clean, hair combed back. He looked older somehow, though only weeks had passed. The weight of testimony, of confession, of rebuilding had carved new lines around his eyes. "I wanted to return this," he said, holding out a key. "And to see the work, one last time." Sarah stepped aside, allowing him entrance. David rose from the table, and for a moment the three of them stood in the living room Marcus had burned and rebuilt, surrounded by boxes that marked both an ending and an uncertain beginning. "You did beautiful work," Sarah said, and meant it. The craftsmanship was evident in every joint, every carefully matched piece of trim. Marcus had rebuilt their home with the kind of attention that spoke of penance, of a man trying to make something right that could never truly be undone. "I got the letter from the parole board," Marcus said. 18 months with credit for time served, community service, restitution payments. He paused, looking around the room. "It's more than fair." David cleared his throat. "The prosecutor wasn't happy with our testimony." "No," Marcus agreed. "But it was the truth. All of it." They stood in silence. Three people bound together by fire and its aftermath, by choices made in moments of desperation and grace extended when it seemed impossible. The house around them was whole again, but they all understood that some things, once broken, never quite fit together the same way. "Where will you go?" Sarah asked. "My sponsor found me a place across town. Construction work with a company that hires people like me." Marcus managed a thin smile. "People trying to rebuild more than just houses." Sarah nodded, recognizing the honesty in his words. They were all trying to rebuild something: homes, marriages, lives, faith. The work would take longer than anyone anticipated. "If you ever need anything," David said, surprising both Sarah and himself with the offer. "References for work or just—" He trailed off, unable to name what else Marcus might need from them, what any of them might need from each other. "Thank you," Marcus said simply. He walked to the window, looking out at the garden where Sarah had been working to restore what the flames had damaged. New growth was emerging among the old roots, tender shoots reaching toward light. "I used to think redemption meant going back to who you were before, making it like it never happened." He turned back to face them. "But that's not it, is it? It's about becoming something new, something better than what you were, even if the scars remain." Sarah felt tears she hadn't expected. David moved closer to her, not quite touching but near enough that she could feel his presence, his own uncertain reaching towards something they might still save. "The scars remain," she agreed, "but they don't have to define what comes next." Marcus nodded, understanding passing between them that needed no words. He headed for the door, then stopped. "I'll keep your family in my prayers." "And we'll keep you in ours," Sarah replied. After he left, David and Sarah stood among their boxes, surrounded by walls that were both familiar and foreign. The house was ready for them to return, but they weren't ready for the house. Not yet, maybe not ever, in the way they once had been. "We don't have to decide today," David said finally. Sarah looked at her husband, seeing him clearly perhaps for the first time in years. "No," she said, "we don't." Outside, spring continued its patient work of renewal, and somewhere across town, a man who had learned the true cost of fire began again the slow work of building something that might last.